podium. Panel left, panel left. Panel right.
Welcome, everyone. Everyone, thanks for attending the CBA Grayson Jockey Club presentation of the Sesamoiditis and Stifle study results. We would like to thank Fasig-Tipton, Horse Sense, and TaylorMade for their sponsorship of this event. This is going to be some really great information that uses data to further all of our understandings of radiograph results. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Wayne McElrath, who was one of the head researchers, who's going to explain some of the results for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, and welcome. Good to see people here. So this is pretty exciting for us, at least, in that we've had terrific support for this project. It started 7 years ago, and we finally got some data. We haven't got all the data, but I'll explain that. But today, Chris Kalchak and I are going to present the results of the radiographic side of the study on both subchondral lucencies in the medial femoral condyle in yearling and 2-year-old thoroughbred sales. That's what I'm going to present, and then Chris will follow up with presenting the sesamoiditis or the sesamoid changes. So just a couple of acknowledgements that are important. The team, Dr. Francis Pete did all the field work, assisted by a number of people, but a terrific amount of work. She's a New Zealander who did her sports medicine residency with us and then got involved in this is her PhD project. Unfortunately, after all the data was collected, she developed a medical issue that's remained with her, and so she can't travel to present this, but she's still actively working on the project. But it does explain some of the delays in getting the suspensory data out, the ultrasound part of the study, which Chris will talk about. So Chris Kalchak, myself, Francis is still enrolled as a PhD student at CSU, and Dan Mork did the statistics. We're all at Colorado State. Jeff Burke was integrally involved from the start, and he's here today and going to run the panel. Dr. Dave Keenan didn't get his photograph in time, but I only asked him 24 hours ago. But he's in New Zealand. He's been a great help with Francis reading a lot of the radiographs. We all had to agree on what we were seeing as the same. We did equivalent studies, and then and Dave has been an important part too. Funding sources are really important. Excuse me. We got a research grant from the Grayson Jockey Club Research Foundation, but the total amount involved in this study was $750,000, and we couldn't have done it with huge support from Grayson, from Keeneland, Fasig-Tipton, and then a number of individual donors whose generosity finished up the figure, and they're listed here. And some of them, I'm pleased to see, are here. So as an introduction, repository films or digital radiographs were initiated in the 1990s here to assist decision-making in regard to a particular horse's predicted orthopedic soundness and buyer's risk tolerance. Findings that are deemed as increased risk without sufficient evidence, quotes, drastically weakens the marketplace and negatively impacts the whole industry, and that's a quote from CBA. One published study used non-digital radiographs, and at that time, this was the previously published study in thoroughbreds, which is quite some time ago. Al Kane was the first author, but Dick Park and myself were involved from CSU, and then Norm Rantanen and Jim Moorhead and Larry Bramlage were also authors. And that was when we didn't really have consistent Stifle radiographs, and of course we didn't have digital radiographs. The repository had started, but all these radiographs were from Jim Moorhead's practice and were plain films. So the objectives of this study, and this is the component, was to identify the prevalence, this component, the Stifle component, of medial femoral condylar subchondral cystic lesions on Sales repository radiographs in yearling and 2-year-old thoroughbreds, to identify any association between the grades of MFC, SCL, and future racing performance, and also to monitor changes in MFC, SCL grades between yearling and 2-year-old Sales. So the methods we used, radiographs were obtained with consigner permission from September 2016 Keeneland yearling sale. And we got great support here. I'll list the number of consigners, but it was impressive. And we went through 2,500 plus sets of radiographs that we were permitted to have access to from Keeneland. And then we also collected radiographs from 5 subsequent 2-year-old Sales in 2017. And that included Fasig-Tipton Gulfstream, Ocala Breeders' Sale, OBS Spring, Fasig-Tipton Maryland, and OBS June. Consigners received a letter prior to each sale from the sales company on behalf of us, but explaining the study's purpose, methods, and confidentiality measures, and we had great support, and that's a critical part. Now, as far as the radiologic evaluation, and I'll go through each of the grades separately, but this is just showing grade 0, which is obviously normal femoral condyle. And then this is the radiologic appearance and how we graded them. It's listed here, but we'll go through each of them individually. So this is a radiograph, and of course, as most people know here, we do a cranial caudal radiograph and a cranial caudal medial oblique. And so this is showing each view here on one case of a type 1 lesion. And a type 1 lesion is a mild, shallow, crescent-shaped lucency with a proximodistal depth of less than or equal to 3 millimeters, with an axial abaxial width, in other words, a side-to-side width which is greater than the depth. So you're getting one of these longitudinally shaped lesions. And by the way, we're going to do 2 things. At the end of this seminar, we're posting a list of take-homes as far as our results and their significance. So 1 page each, and Jeff and Chris and I have put these sheets together, and so you don't need to try and copiously keep up with any notes or memory, because that will come out. And then we're also going to hopefully have a press release within 24 hours of a layman version of the results for both the Stifles and the sesamoid lesions. So back to the lesions, this is a grade 2. And again, we're looking at the cranial caudal as well as the cranial caudal oblique. And a grade 2 lesion is a moderate dome-shaped lucency that extends through the subchondral bone with a depth approaching that of the width. So in other words, you've got this, it's greater than 3 millimeters deep, and depth approaches width or exceeds width. These are those here. And then last but not least, a grade 3 is what we used to call, a subchondral bone cyst, a subchondral cystic lesion, and it's a large spherical or ovoid cystic lesion that communicates with the central articular surface of the condyle. So what's important here, you've got a large circular lesion, which you can see on the radiographs, but it articulates with the central weight-bearing portion of the condyle. Now, the reason we're stressing that is there's another category of subchondral cystic lesion that occurs, and I'll show you a picture in a minute, but the axial cysts, we always had the hypothesis that they weren't significant, or they weren't significant to the racing success, and we did confirm that in this study. So it's important that when we talk about grade 3s, we're talking about the grade 3 that's down to the articular surface here in the central weight-bearing portion. Just to finish off, sorry, that went accidentally, and here it is here. So lucencies within the axial aspect of the MFC come up. They're adjacent to the medial intercondylar eminence. In other words, here's your medial intercondylar eminence here on the tibia, and these are on the axial side, which means the central side here. These are just 3 different examples, but you can see that they're not affecting that central weight-bearing portion. And that is important because when I tell you the results, every one of those horses race, and there was no evidence of any problems. So our methods included follow-up racing performance, and this took a lot of, obviously a lot of time. We agreed when we started the study that we'd go to the 4-year-old racing year, through the 4-year-old racing year, so that means January the 1st, 2017 to December 31st, 2019. Our data came from Equibase. We had 8 outcome variables that we looked at, including start at a race, age at first race, career total number of starts, total earnings, earnings per start, best start, weighted, listed, and group graded race starts, and class performance index. So there's a number of things there, but you'll see in the summary of the results that it didn't negatively affect these, at least the Stifle lesions didn't. Non-starter follow-up, so this was where the tricky bit, because we had 85% of the horses in the study starting, so that's good. But the ones that didn't start, we had to try and ascertain whether they didn't start because they had a Stifle problem, or in the case of the sesamoids, same population, they had a fetlock problem. And so that took a lot of work. We didn't get 100% of them, but we got a lot of them, which makes it really exciting. The advantage we had is that we started this study prospectively in the 2016, at the September 2016, and so we kept track of all these horses as well as we could, particularly the ones that didn't start. And this is just showing our non-starter follow-up, the flow chart that we use to minimize bias. And there was a correlation, we made a correlation between MFC grades using maximum lucency grades per horse, and all that means is that maximum grade that it ever achieved, because we did get 20% of horses that changed their grade between yearling and 2-year-old sale. 20%. 80% did not, and I'm going to show that data shortly. So we went to December 31st, 2019. Analysis was by logistic binomial or linear regression as appropriate, with the threshold for significance set at alpha 0.05. We'll have a test on that one later. So getting to the results, we're going through this pretty quickly, but we will be presenting a publication on it, and as well as I said, the take-homes are coming out tomorrow morning. We had 71 consigners that agreed to be involved. 10.9% of the registered foal crop was the population we had at Keeneland. 36% of North American yearlings sold at auction that year in 2016 were in the study. 2-year-olds, we actually got 45 consigners to participate, which was 78% of all eligible 2-year-olds sold in 2017, and 19.7% of the 2-year-olds sold at auction. So we ended up with Stifle radiographs for 2,508 yearlings, which is 55,016 Stifles, and 436 2-year-olds. 872 Stifles were included in the study. MFC SCLs of grades 1 to 3 were observed in 242 or 9.65% of yearlings and 49 or 11.2% of 2-year-olds. Bilateral MFC SCLs of grades 1 to 3 were observed in 54 horses, which is only 2.2% of yearlings and 12 or 2.8% of 2-year-olds. So quite a lot of consistency between yearling and 2-year-olds. So the two critical questions are how these lesions affected racing, but also how many progress or change radiographically, obviously, particularly interesting to pinhookers, but also, I think, interesting to all of us because, you know, how are you going to predict that? What's the likelihood of change? So grade 1 MFC SCLs in yearlings remain static in 14 out of 31. This is just, obviously, we're limited to using the horses that we had follow-up radiographs as 2-year-olds. Grade 1 in yearlings remain static in 14 out of 31, progressed to a grade 2 in 6 out of 31, or resolved 11 out of 31 by the 2-year-old sale, which is around about 20%. 80% either stayed static or got better. Grade 2 MFC SCLs in yearlings, remember they're the dome-shaped ones, remain static in 6 out of 10, progressed to a grade 33. A grade 3, that should be, in 2 out of 10, or improved to a grade 1 in 2 out of 10 by the 2-year-old sale. Axial MFC lucencies, I mentioned these before. 7 yearlings had lucencies located in the axial aspect of the MFC. This is not a controversial thing because I think most people recognize they weren't the same. Adjacent to the medial intercondylar eminence of the tibia, we got 7 out of 2,508, which is obviously only 0.28%. It ranged in appearance from irregular lucencies to cystic lucencies. 2 of these yearlings presented again at 2-year-old sales, and the axial MFC lucencies persisted in both of them. The good news is that no new axial MFC lucencies were seen in 2-year-olds that did not have them as yearlings, and none of them, all of them raced. So back to the overall associations with racing performance. So this is back to the 3 grades we had. And so this type's pretty small, but you're going to get these data. 84.2% with grade 0. In other words, normal on the Stifle radiographs. 84.2% raced, started a race. 87.1% of grade 1s, 80 and 91% of grade 2s raced as well, started a race. And you know, for obvious reasons, I think, well, probably reasons that are obvious to you, once they started, that was a win or a success, and we didn't go further with how many, but we have got some interesting data as far as number of starts go when they had lesions compared to normal. Now, 76.9% of grade 3s raced, started a race, which is still below the level of, it's still not quite statistically significant, but that's probably we've concluded that that was a numbers thing rather than, and I'll come back and discuss that a little, a numbers thing rather than real. In other words, we did have reduced starting a race with grade 3s, but still remember that 76.9% started. So we looked at these other outcome parameters, age at first race start, no significant difference, that's what NSD is with horses with any grade. Number of race starts, no significant difference with horses with any grade, MFC grade. Earnings, no significant difference between total earnings or earnings per start and any MFC grade, controlling for gender. And what we're talking about there is we do know that there's a tendency to retire a filly, whereas you're not going to retire a male. And so we controlled for gender, and there were no significant difference. No difference in class performance index, which is a multiple figures of performance. So how many progress or change radiographically? We're sort of discussing the final results here, really. Grade 1 MFC subchondral cysts and yearlings remain static. I've given you these figures before, 14 out of 31. Progressed to a grade 2, 6 out of 31, or resolved, 11 out of 31. So fairly high resolution rate. The bottom line is, and we've got bullets for this in the the three of us have put together, that will come out tomorrow morning, I think, is 80% either remained static or improved between yearling and 2-year-old year, and 20% got a grade worse. Grade 2 MFC SCL, similarly, it was around 20%, but 6 out of 10 remained static. 2 out of 10 progressed to a grade 3 or improved to a grade 1. 2 out of 10 did that by the 2-year-old sale. So what do we do with grade 3s? We acknowledge that, you know, and I showed you the decreased figure, but albeit 76.9%. We acknowledge that despite no statistical significance, this could be associated with low numbers. Because by the time we did this study in 2016, so really repeating it here, but 79.6% raced, there are two scenarios whereby people might be uncomfortable. And of course, one of them is the fact that you do a survey radiograph in February, you see a grade 3 lesion, you pull it out of the sale. Or alternatively, the horse becomes lame or some other problem develops, it gets pulled out of the sale. So you've got to take that in point, but just remember that 79.6% still raced. However, with these data, we think there might be less discomfort than there was previously, because we've got grade 1 and 2s had no significant effect on starting a race, and grade 3s still had a 76.9% that raced. So in light of the information, horses with these findings can still be considered a value purchase when everything else is considered. Racing performance for 2-year-old sales horses that had grade 3 MFC subchondral cystic lesions. Racing performance outcomes above refer to yearling MFC findings. The 5 horses with grade 3 MFC lesions at 2-year-old sale all went on to start at least one race. Total number of starts is listed here for those who are interested in those data. So it wasn't like they just started one race. It's likely, as I mentioned before, that we underestimated the prevalence of severe lesions in the entire thoroughbreds born in 2015. The findings on screening radiographs that potentially could inhibit sale value could cause consignors to withdraw. We talked about that. But again, as I mentioned before, hopefully our results will provide a reduction in these decisions, and it might encourage people to keep them in the sale. So in addition to the acknowledgements of donors, we certainly want to acknowledge, this is just refers, and Chris will also talk about acknowledgement in the Sesamoid paper, the Keeneland Association, Fasig-Tipton and Ocala Breeders' Company, supporting the study at their sales assistance, and they provided assistance at obtaining consignor consent, facilitating radiographic collection for us, because these all went back into our computer system. There were 116 consignors, and they did a terrific job, particularly some of the consignors in Florida who helped us and were willing to allow the horses, the 2-year-olds, to be ultrasounded again. We'd ultrasounded a collection of them as yearlings, and then we were able to get follow-up ultrasounds with them. Dr. Ann Hess for additional statistical guidance. So I'm going to hand over now to Chris Kalchak, and he's going to talk about the sesamoiditis, or the sesamoid lesions part of the study, and then we'll reconvene with the panel. Thank you. You don't need to plug in. That's a good question for the discussion. Sorry to cut you off, but we agreed we'd get through this so that, you know, the open slather can start after that. Thanks.
That one's up. That one's not.
You're up.
Yep. All right, great. Well, thank you. For that, most of you probably don't know who I am. I'm Chris Kalchak. I'm an equine surgeon and sports medicine clinician at CSU. I've worked with Dr. McElraith for 30 plus years. I've been on the Grayson Scientific Advisory Committee several times in the past. And most notably, probably my biggest link with Lexington is having worked for Drs. Bramlage and Edmondson. I hate to say it, but probably over 30 years ago. So the ties are close, and exclusively the work that I do as a researcher at CSU is equine orthopedics, mostly on the thoroughbred racehorse. So that kind of frames why I'm up here giving this. I'm going to be relatively brief. I think Wayne did a great job of acknowledging the funding bodies and the consignors and everybody involved. The sesamoid data, there's a lot of it, and you could really go down a rabbit hole pretty quick. We only know that because we have several times. So I'm going to basically give a pretty broad summary of those data, and then we can, you know, if we need to go down a rabbit hole, we can, especially if folks think it's important. Clinical relevance, a lot of the radiographic findings on the sesamoid bones have contentious significance. In the past, those changes have been termed sesamoiditis. Usually when itis is on the end of the word, it means it's inflamed. And I don't know that that's actually been documented in this particular sense. So I think from our lens, we were wanting to at least more clearly define what this might be on the X-ray without, or at least what the sign is without attributing a specific cause. What we'll find out today is there's three main things that were significant from this part of the study, and I'll go through these in detail and we'll review them at the end as well. Just a little bit of history. This has been looked at obviously numerous times. Al Kane and the group originally attributed no significant effect from changes on the sesamoid to those two performance. And then Dr. Spike Pierce and Bramlage then they redefined what the categories were and did show that there were decreased mean starts and earnings with greater than 2 abnormal linear lucencies. Lucencies being the dark spots on the sesamoids, which have been characterized as sesamoiditis. And then McClellan and Plevin had also seen significant sesamoid changes associated with clinical suspensory branch lesion on homebreds, but it really depended on what grading scheme of x-rays that they used, right? So there's no doubt that there was an issue with the fact that there were several different grading schemes. Maybe not everybody was speaking the same language. And so one of our goals was to really hone down on how best to define those changes on the sesamoids. And just again, briefly, we did that. We didn't do it in a vacuum. We actually worked with Dr. Spike Pierce and Bramlage and a number of people throughout the industry to really start to define how we best characterize these changes. So what you'll see here today is really a group effort from a number of people in the industry to hopefully more clearly define what we're looking at and be able to communicate that between veterinarians and with our clients. So similar to the Stifle our study aims, we wanted to evaluate the radiologic appearance of sesamoids in a large number of horses. We wanted to define the range and prevalence of those findings, analyze the associations with racing performance, and then also evaluate the changes in the sesamoid between the yearling and 2-year-old year, at least in those horses that we have both years of x-rays. And then again, see if there was an association in some changes with reduced performance. So most of you have probably seen these. This is a blown up picture of an oblique view of a fetlock joint isolated on the sesamoid bone. Our grading scheme, again, that collectively we decided on was to basically look at and measure the length of what we now define as a vascular channel. So it's basically the length from the outer surface of the bone down to the depth that we could see this. So on every horse, every sesamoid, we basically measured this length, and then we identified the spot where it narrowed down to 2 millimeters or less. And to us, a significant vascular channel was one that was greater than or equal to 2 millimeters for a greater than 1/3 of its length. So there's a lot packed in there. This one, it's 2 millimeters for over half of its length. So we defined it as significant if it was 1/3 or greater. Hopefully that makes sense, and I'll show you examples. We defined them put them into 4 different grades or categories. Grade 0, as you can see on the left, they can still have a lucency or a dark spot on that, which may or may not have been called sesamoiditis in the past. But it was less than 2 millimeters for 1/3 of its length, okay? And in this case, it doesn't even hit 2 millimeters in width. A grade 1 was a single vascular channel that was greater than 2 millimeters over 1/3 or more. And then it goes from there. Grade 2 was 2 of them. Grade 3 was 3 or more. And some of them you can see were quite significant. We also characterized what happened on what's called the abaxial surface, or that outer surface of the bone itself. So in this case, we characterized or identified horses that had abaxial new bone formation, or basically just a bump of bone on that outer surface, because a lot of times significance has been placed on that. Abaxial margin concavity was basically a dip in that bone on that side. I know this is hard to see, but in the second from the left, you'll see where those arrows are. There's basically an area, a scalloped edge to that surface. And then fragments, which again, a lot of you are familiar with, both abaxial and apical fragments. So we identified which horses had those and looked at their follow-up as well. So it's a lot of sesamoids. It's 20,000 sesamoids in the yearlings, nearly 3,500 in the 2-year-olds. And you can see how those lesions or how those changes are distributed in those groups of horses. Obviously not a huge incidence of it, but certainly enough to be able to have a pretty robust statistical analysis. Now for the results. Again, I'm going to just try to focus on things that we think were significant. There are many other parts to this study, and it's not published yet, so the details are not out there. But the most significant we saw is that the proportion of yearlings that ended up racing with grade 0, so no change, 85% raced, 85.6% of those with grade 1 lesions raced, and 82.6% of those with grade 2 raced. And then it dropped significantly, meaning statistically, there was statistical significance in that those horses with grade 3 lesions, significantly less of those had raced than in the other categories. So in those top 3 categories, 82 to 85% of those horses raced, where it dropped to 67.2% with the grade 3 lesions. The other thing that was significant was the abaxial new bone formation, especially on the sesamoids on the forelimbs, the front legs. All the horses without that change, nearly 85% had started at least one race, where it dropped to 77.7, so almost 78%. Again, statistically significant in that case. And then again, the next couple of slides get a little bit busy, but I'll just try to highlight those areas that were significant. When we looked at fragments, again, the significance is on the forelimbs. Those horses with apical or abaxial fragments, 61.3% race compared to, again, nearly 85% of those horses that did not have fragments. And when you look at it, although it's not significant, most of those were abaxial fragments in that case. So no statistically significant difference, but again, you can just look at the numbers and see what those look like. And then to really make it complex, and again, I'll try to simplify it, probably the easiest thing to do is just read the left-hand column. There was significant change in those sesamoid changes over time between yearling and 2-year-old year, which I think is quite impressive. Of those horses as yearlings with grade 0 lesions, or grade 0 changes, 91.3% remained static. Some of them did worsen, but the majority of them, almost all of them, remained static. When you look at the grade 1s, 72.3% had improved to grade 0, and 21.7% remained static, so very few worsened, if any at all. Grade 2s, 48.6% had improved to grade 0s, 35.2% to 1, and 10.5% remained static. But probably the thing, at least for me, that is quite impressive is out of the grade 3s, 86.7% had improved to either a 2, a 1, or a 0, which is quite dramatic. And I think, again, this may be a discussion point. Unfortunately, we don't have the ultrasound results yet, because a big question with this group, these grade 3s, is, well, if 86.7% improved, why did they do so much worse statistically? Remember, that was as yearlings, not as 2-year-olds. And so again, for some reason, they get better, but yet their performance still suffers. Hopefully that makes sense. So again, to summarize, and I'll add a couple other things: reduced likelihood of starting a race with grade 3 vascular channels, especially in the forelimbs, abaxial new bone formation in the forelimbs, and apical or abaxial fragments in the forelimbs as well. Now for yearlings, for those that did race, and again, this is a summary, grade 3 vascular channels in the forelimb sesamoids were associated with fewer starts. Grade 3 channels in the hind limb sesamoids were associated with delayed start to racing careers. And abaxial new bone in forelimb sesamoids was associated with lower total earnings and earnings per start. So I've basically taken about 1,000 pages of data and put it on a couple of slides. This does seem to be a logical progression. Again, we're probably a little bit biased, but it does seem to be a logical progression for sesamoid grading based on the work that Kane et al., and of course Spike, Pearson, Bramlage and their group, and McClellan and Plevin has done as well. And again, I think having a collective discussion and agreement on what the grading scheme was for this study was important. It does seem to be easy to use. We each went through on the computer and did it. You can do it fairly quickly. You can use the functions on the software now to do that, and it's pretty time effective. Again, grade 3 vascular channels and abaxial bone formation seem to be of significance. And really, I think, again, the thing here to remember is there was no significant impact on racing performance with less than grade 3s. And that's it. Thank you. So I think now Dr. Burke is going to lead a panel discussion. I think those of you who are on the panel, if you could come up, and it looks like there's 3 on each side, and I'll leave it for you, Jeff.
Yeah. Is this up enough? Could we turn the volume up a little bit? Okay. If the panel members want to come up, what we're going to do in order to make this as efficient as possible, we're unfortunately working under a time frame, and we're going to need to close this up at 5:30. So what I'd like to do is, Rob has a QR code, a little sheet of paper with a QR code on it, and anybody that has a question, if you'll just raise your hand, we'll give you one of these. You can scan it and then submit your question, and that way we can get through them as quickly as possible. And I'm sure we're not going to get through all of them, so what we'll do is any questions that don't get answered, we'll go ahead, I'll submit those to the panel members, and we'll probably through CBA, we'll have the answers from the panel members. So let's go ahead and get started. Have a seat. I think the first question that I've got here, which would probably be the most obvious one for the panel members, is having listened to the two presentations from Drs. McElraith and Kowchak, how will those findings let's just start with the sesamoid paper. How will the findings in the sesamoid paper influence your approach to evaluating horses for clients at the sales? Anybody want to go, or do you want me to pick on you?
I think it's thank you for doing this study, by the way. It's very, very nice. Adds a lot of clarity to what we do, which we all know that sesamoiditis is way overdiagnosed. If we can have clarity, which we seem to have in this, it's easier for us to be able to describe the actual lesion and the actual disease, and be able to give a prognosis for those in racing. Of course, it'd be interesting when the scans compare to these, but right now I think this is a great start. A lot of the grade zeros are called sesamoiditis. We all read the reports. I think, they found that 85% are normal, when I can tell you that there's less than 85% that are normal on the radiographs at the yearling sale, so I know it's way overdiagnosed. So it gives clarity that where we can use this system to say, okay, grade one EVCs, vascular channels, sesamoiditis, whatever you want to call it, and we know what that means and be able to prognose the case and describe it to our client.
Yeah, I read through the paper again last night, and to be quite honest with you, I don't think the findings really go against anything I typically represent to my clients. The grade 3s are concerning, the abaxial changes are certainly concerning, the front fragments are concerning. The one thing that I thought was interesting in Chris's point of view is how many of them improve from their yearling to 2-year-old year. And I can tell you, I've had horses that, although they improved radiographically, still had suspensory sesamoid issues as 2-year-olds. So that's a little scary. I think it's really important to see the findings of the suspensory part of this with the ultrasound study, because I think that is going to tie together a lot of questions that we have from what we just see with the sesamoid radiographic study.
Yeah, just checking this is working. Just want to thank Colorado State and everybody for all the efforts in that. That's real work that needs to be done. And from my point of view, now we have some real data that we can tell our clients and talk to them and put real numbers to stuff, rather where previously we were saying this horse might be okay, likely not okay. Now we can actually put some real numbers to it. I think a big thing for me from this would be to try and get some uniformity in how we describe these lesions. So many of us now use different words of slight or mild or moderate, and everybody's a little bit different, and I'm not trying to put everybody in the same box, but it would be really nice, now that we have the technology, to be able to describe and to define these lesions, everybody describing them the same, and we would all have a better understanding. So I think that's a big thing for me for it. In regards to the interpretation, I think, to Dr. Pierce's point, we are 100% overcalling a lot of the sesamoiditis stuff. I think we can see here that the grade 0s and 1s are normal. They're performing just as normal. And I think we should be describing them like that. Maybe research like this gives us the power to be able to say stuff like that. So for me, this study will go a long way to how we describe stuff, how we talk to our clients about different lesions.
Yeah, once again, thank you for all the folks that put this together. It was a monumental task, and I think this is probably the initiation of getting a good conversation and discussion going within the veterinary profession and with the consigners, and hopefully we can agree upon, as they've defined what's real pathology as opposed to irregularities that are actual normal findings, that we can all agree upon defining and grading the concerns that we have on radiographs and assigning accurate relevance to what this means to these horses long term. And the confusion that we've seen in the past creates inefficiencies when we're selling horses. It creates confusion for how you guys should market them and what our clients can expect. And there's plenty of us up here evaluating horses. It's not uncommon to get second and third opinions. And when, as a profession, we're all over the board, it creates additional confusion. And I think that you lose capture on some of the value of these horses simply because if the vets can't sort it out, then maybe I don't want this one. But I hope this starts the conversation and it continues to roll so that we can all get in line with what we agree upon as relevant pathology on these radiographs.
Okay, thanks for those comments. On the heels of that, there's a question regarding the sesamoids, the grading system, and apparently it's in one form or another, it's come from quite a few of you, and the way this one's phrased is, are we comfortable enough with the grading system regarding to the sesamoids to put on the vet report for consigners? I think it's probably less about what's actually on the vet report, because I mean that's a pretty controversial thing about the use of the reports in the shed row anyway, but the point being, are we as veterinarians willing to have this conversation with our clients so that we're all on the same page, as has been said by practically every panel member? You know, when we start using the same terminology and we're talking about the same things, and we know statistically from these studies the likelihood of those horses being okay, I think it's going to require an effort from us as veterinarians to talk with all of our clients and to really bear down on how we want to classify these sesamoids, so that instead of saying mild sesamoiditis or moderate, which we may disagree on because it's a rather nebulous terminology, if we're talking about two vascular channels in a sesamoid, I think we can be a bit more accurate in terms of prognosticating the likelihood of, you know, the horse being okay or not for a particular purpose. At any rate, do you guys, quickly, do you have a feel for how big a task that would be, and whether you think the veterinary community is able to sort of move our clients in the direction of changing the terminology to be something compatible with this and more exact?
Yeah, if we can get everybody to read the study, that would be a start. And two, it's not a lot different than what we've tried to do with upper airways. We're trying to make it less subjective, more consistent. You describe a lesion, you know it's a grade 1 sesamoid, you know the measurements, you know what they should be, you know the prognosis. So I think it's very doable.
Probably not. I think anytime everybody understands the grading system, it's great. The problem is that does take an educational effort among your clientele, and the people that are, really okay with this one's probably okay and this one might not be, or this one's mild, moderate, or severe, are probably going to stick with that. And, even if we can educate them to some degree what a grade 3 means, they're going to correlate that with maybe that's a bigger risk for me. So at the end of the day, I understand that. I mean, we use, like you said, grading systems with scopes all the time, and most people have come to understand that pretty well. So I don't know, it's a huge task. I'll have to see how it plays out.
I was a little surprised. I read through this study last night. I was a little surprised that the average starting the average start in grade 3s was less than 3. I mean, it was like 58 days beyond the other group, but it was still 2, which is contrary to what my discussions are with my clients. You know, I basically go in with those and say they're 3-year-olds. So I was a little surprised about that.
Yeah, thanks. I guess, you know, I knew the question would come up about vet reports, and, you know, we've learning today that grade 0, grade 1 are all normal. Why do you have to put under, do you have to mention that? I still think if we can all get on the same terminology and educate people that now we know that a grade 1 and grade 2 are performing just as fine. They can go to 2-year-old sales, do just as well. You know, grade 3s are probably what we're calling moderate sesamoiditis today. I think anyone in this room knows that does a lot of purchasing, knows that there can be problems. So, you know, I don't think we learned much there in that respect, but from the grading point of view, I think if we can keep the 1s and 2s and, you know, keep the education coming that these horses are perfectly fine to buy, and some of these are getting devalued at sales when now we know that they should not be, so.
I agree with all of that. I mean, I think the sooner we can get away from training the x-rays and developing the x-rays when we're looking in spring surveys and starting to impact how much exercise and how these horses are raised, the better, the sooner we'll get back to, or as we've always been, raising good race horses throughout their lives. And I think I've seen too many horses have exercise restriction because of moderate sesamoiditis, that if we can continue to follow that up, that maybe that's not a significant risk factor. And what is the definition of moderate sesamoiditis? And maybe we need to get away from these and better hone in on the risk factors that may or may not change at all, whether we keep these horses in the stalls. But I find that with my clients, horses that we have felt that were in the stall for more days than some of their pasture mates, then that's probably a risk factor as much as anything, because the soft tissue isn't allowed to develop and the bone density doesn't develop. And so when we go to train on them in Ocala, they don't hold up for one reason or another. It may have nothing to do with the sesamoid that we're looking at.
Okay, thank you. There's one question here that I'm just going to give a quick answer to that probably we won't need to discuss at this point because it's premature, but the question is about the correlation between, well, when we scan suspensory branches relative to sesamoid findings and any correlation between the two. And those are the 2 studies that are upcoming. So it's a bit premature, unfortunately, to talk about the ultrasound findings and how they would correlate to the sesamoid findings, but that will be, that'll be a separate issue that'll be upcoming. We're unfortunately working with a limited time frame this afternoon based on Fasig-Tipton's schedule for some other things. So I want to just get a question in about the Stifles, if we could move on to that. So the question for the panel is, how will the findings in the Stifle paper influence your approach to evaluating horses for clients at the sales?
I think this is a discussion we have. I work for buyers, most of you know that, and this discussion you have, and especially with someone that's not so educated, is you talk about the medial condyle and you start talking, oh, this is the area where they form bone cysts, et cetera, these grade 3s. Well, this actually adds a lot of, again, a lot of clarity to my description of, or our description of the Stifle. And then knowing that only, I think, very few ones, it was encouraged to me to see how few of the 2-year-olds developed into grade 3s. It was just 2 out of a bunch. And so even grade 2s to 3s and 1s to 3s, I don't think there were any 1s to 3s in the group. So that was encouraging. So it gives clarity on a very important area that is commonly discussed as to clients, and it's a concern, and it gives us a little bit of comfort here, or me anyway.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I don't think I've ever really had a lot of problem with grade 1s and grade 2s, and I'm glad to see this study has pretty much been gone along with that thought. And you know, at the grade 3 level is where the discussion becomes about risk tolerance. And I've got guys that'll, or buyers that will take on a lot of risk, and I've got buyers that'll take on zero risk. And you know, and I've certainly had experiences with horses that have done just fine with grade 3s, and I've had plenty of experiences with horses that have done poorly with grade 3s and maybe gone on to do better later in life. So, you know, all those things are in play when you're talking to a potential buyer, which is most of what I do. But you know, the grade 3s are where we spend a lot of time talking about how much risk you want to take.
I think the big thing for me out of all these studies was the grade 3 stifles. You know, we were always kind of taught that a big medial condyle cyst was big and bad and just stay away from it. But now we can see here that the punishment doesn't fit the crime. Some of these horses are, you know, maybe at 5 to 10% increased risk of not making a start, but those horses are getting devalued by 90% or 100% in some cases. They're just giving away. So I think the big message from this is that it's okay if you're willing to take a little bit more risk to buy these horses with big stifle cysts. And another thing leading on from this is the success we're having with doing some of the surgeries on these cysts. If they do go lame, a lot of them are coming back and racing. So I think a big take-home message from this is, you know, don't walk away. If you love a horse, don't walk away from it just because it's got a big cyst in the stifle. You know, I think you should be pretty comfortable if you can take a little bit more risk on that and you're getting some value for it. Absolutely leave that horse on your list.
Yeah, it's interesting to see. It doesn't seem, if it doesn't bother them, boy, they run. The grade 3s will bother a few, but I think it offers a reason for pause when you see a grade 3 before just summarily disqualifying the horse and say, no, this isn't something we can work with, because I think the study shows that there's a lot of good athletes. This has not impacted their career at all, seemingly. So, yeah, it's still hard to wrap our mind around an 18 millimeter cyst, but it does show with large numbers that it's not bothering nearly as many as we've said it was going to.
Okay, one thing, this is more of a general comment than anything else, but the value of studies like this is that we've got to remember that what we're trying to do with large numbers of horses, studying them like this, is giving percentages. And so clients, I think, can respond to that depending on their own risk tolerance. And I think that's a very good thing. It's just important to keep in mind that when we're vetting horses, we can never say anything about one individual horse. There's so many other factors that determine whether they're going to be good race horses or not. And it's very, and I'm, you know, on the scale, I would probably consider myself, when I'm working for people that are talented at buying horses, I'm really trying hard not to let horses come off their list. But having said that, the value is in matching the risk tolerance with the science here. And if something is 90% good, there's always the possibility that you could be the 1 out of 10 where it's not good. And I think that that's the difficulty that we have. We're not really predicting on individual horses. We're just giving hopefully accurate numbers based on large numbers of horses that can help guide you when you're buying and selling horses in terms of assigning value to your horses, even if you're on the selling end of it. So I'm sorry that we have to wrap this up because I think we could keep going, but we're under some time constraints. So Rob, I'm just going to turn this over to you.
Good, thanks everyone. Thanks for participating. I think we got some really great information. We really want to thank TaylorMade for a couple of raffle prizes that they donated for us today. And I think we will let Mr. Reyes over here draw our winning person and just make sure somebody you like. Should I put it back? It is Ridge Rose. will win our Malone's gift card.
There, I just want to say, if there are any questions that you'd like answered, please submit them, and we'll make sure that the panel gets a look at them. Thank you.
And our bottle of Not This Time bourbon is going to Sally Lockhart. You want to come down here, and we have our prizes down here. Sally Lockhart. Is Ridge Rose still here?